My marriage to Hugo was purely one of convenience. In my previous life, I never recognized that such a union was just a business arrangement. I not only demanded Hugo's love, hoping to be a normal wife, but I also flaunted my status as the legitimate spouse, constantly stirring up trouble for his first love. In the end, I ruined not just the marriage, but also the partnership between our families. While my family went bankrupt and I was driven to a fatal desperation, Hugo leapt to become the richest man, married his first love, and flourished in both love and career. When I opened my eyes this time, I was back at the moment when I first cornered Hugo and his first love in the club's private room. Hugo frowned at me. "Nina, we had an agreement before this marriage. Apart from appearing together as needed, we wouldn't interfere in each other's private lives. What exactly do you mean by this?" His tone carried a suppressed anger. In my past life, I hadn't noticed it at all. Instead, I had arrogantly slapped his first love in the name of being Hugo's wife, setting myself on a path of self-destruct. Thinking of my past death plunging off a cliff in a desperate car chase, I quickly waved my hand. Don't misunderstand. I just came to the wrong place. Carry on, I understand the rules of a marriage at convenience. I stepped out of the room, thoughtfully closing the door for them, then turned to find a few of the model guys. Last life had taught me nothing, a rich, leisurely husband who didn't come home. And I had been foolishly chasing after Hugo's love. After sipping a little wine while feeling the model guys, ton de BS, I received a voice message from my best friend Chloe. "Nina, you didn't actually go to the club to corner Hugo and Ivy, did you? Don't act rashly. Everyone knows Ivy is Hugo's first love. If you provoke her, Hugo won't let it slide. It's just a marriage of convenience, don't overthink it." Her words were clear. But in my previous life, I hadn't listened. Despite knowing that Hugo had lost both parents at 13 and that I had been staying at Ivy's home, developing a bond with her that went beyond ordinary friendship, I had foolishly agreed to the marriage and relentlessly troubled Ivy afterward. Cornering Hugo and Ivy at the club, I had slapped Ivy in the name of being Hugo's wife. Following that, Hugo forced me to kneel at the ancestral hall for 3 days. And my family had to concede 5% in a joint project. When I felt bitter over Hugo favoring Ivy, I never realized that this concession was the seed that eventually led to my family's bankruptcy. Thinking of the fatal end that awaited me last life sent shivers down my spine. I quickly replied to Chloe, "I'm not that foolish. It's just a marriage of convenience. I don't care about his first love or any so-called black moonlight. As long as Hugo continues to push forward the joint projects, so I can profit handsomely, I couldn't care less about anything else." To prove my newfound detachment, I even sent Chloe photos of the model guys. She was thrilled, praising me for being sane, and immediately decided to come join me. I sent her my location. Not long after, the private room door opened, but it wasn't Chloe. Hugo stood at the doorway, black suit sharp against his tall, commanding figure, radiating an icy aura. He scanned the scattered glasses and the model guys before his gaze settled on me. His voice dark. "Having fun?" I froze for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. But my fun is mostly about quantity. Nothing like having your beloved Ivy by your side." Apparently, having fulfilled me. Something I said displeased him. For his aura grew even colder. In the past, seeing this, I would have immediately rushed over to fuss over him. But now, I just stared blankly. So he came over just to ask if I was enjoying myself? I absnessed and lead touched a model guy's ABS again. Suddenly, Hugo moved closer. "There's media outside the club. We need to cooperate." I realized the reason he wasn't with Ivy media presence outside. To prevent any unwanted photos that could spark rumors and affect the business cooperation, he had to come find me. Business was business. I got up promptly, smiling regretfully at the model guys. "Sorry, everyone. I have something to do. Next time." Before I could finish, Hugo gripped my wrist and pulled me out. His utter lack of gentleness made me twitch my lips in helpless fury. Outside, I glanced around. No media. Not even a single person. I raised an eyebrow. "Where's the media?" Hugo said nothing. When the valet brought the car, he politely opened the door for me. guiding me in as though we were a close, married couple. But I knew he was just acting. He never revealed the media's location. And I didn't press. Surely, he wouldn't trick me for fun. Media must be lurking somewhere. Once Hugo got in, I realized this was the first time in 6 months of our marriage of convenience that we were alone together. Last life, I would have cherished this moment, trying to impress him. Now, I didn't bother. The car started, and the wine kicked in. Without a word, I leaned back and fell asleep. When I woke, we had arrived at the N and Hu Villa, our marital home, though only I ever lived there. Hugo stayed in a spacious flat near the family's headquarters, next to Ivy. I didn't expect him to continue the gentlemanly act of opening the door for me, so I pushed it open myself, landing lightly on the ground. After a few steps, I noticed Hugo had also gotten out. I paused, surprised. "Hugo, not staying at the flat tonight?" He gave me a faint glance, said nothing, and continued toward the villa. Since it was jointly owned, I said nothing and followed. Inside, I was about to ask Shang Ma to make some hangover soup when Hugo interrupted. "It's late. Don't call anyone. I'll make it." He rolled up his sleeves and went into the kitchen. Watching him busy, my chest tightened. Hugo always did this, acting cold outwardly but performing small acts of warmth privately. Hangover soup now. Holding my hand at our wedding then. It was these gestures that had led me to falsely believe we could be normal spouses. To flaunt the wife's status. To provoke Ivy. And ultimately, hadn't fulfilled my ancestry, to bring about my family's ruin. Thinking of that tragic past left me gloomy. When he brought the soup, I drank it in silence without a word of thanks. Then headed upstairs to sleep. Hugo followed. As I reached the bedroom door, I noticed him stop outside, poised as though he intended to share the room. I chuckled at myself. Impossible. Hugo was the epitome of self-restraint aside from Ivy. There was no other woman in his life. The idea that he would want to share a room with me was absurd. Right now, at most, he was just escorting my drunken self back to my room out of sheer courtesy. I didn't want to misread the situation, so I said lightly, "This is fine. You can leave me here." Then I shut the door, leaving Hugo outside. Before closing it, I caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes. But I didn't bother overthinking what he was surprised about and just collapsed onto the bed, drifting straight to sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. My phone was flooded with messages from Chloe, and only then did I remember I had invited her to the club yesterday. But she hadn't arrived yet when Hugo had whisked me away. I quickly apologized to Chloe and explained what had happened. She replied almost immediately, "Hugo pulled you away? Could it be he got jealous seeing your male model around?" I stared at the message in disbelief. Dawn had barely broken, and Chloe was already daydreaming. After chatting with her, I went downstairs for breakfast, only to find Hugo lounging on the sofa in his lounge, reviewing financial reports. I froze. This had never happened before. Hugo was a workaholic. Even at the wedding, he had interrupted the vows to take a work call. Seeing him off duty like this was a first. Worried, I asked, "Hugo go? The Hugo family isn't going bankrupt, right?" Forgive my mind for jumping there after all. In my previous life, adding fulfill I'd say. The Nina family's collapse had left a deep scar. Hugo set down his papers. Looked up at me. His expression unreadable. "No. I just wanted to give myself a day off." Ah, that explained it. I let out a sigh of relief. "All right. Then. Whatever you feel like eating today. Just tell Zhang Ma to make it." I hastily drank my milk, ready to leave. Hugo looked momentarily startled. You're not staying home today?" I was busy putting on my shoes and didn't even glance at him. "Yes. I have something to do." And with that, I walked out, completely oblivious to the unusual look on his face behind me. I drove straight to my parents' villa. As soon as I entered, I saw my mother watering the flowers in the garden while my father sat nearby in the pavilion, sipping tea, watching them bathed in sunlight. My throat tightened. In my previous life, during the car accident, my parents hadn't thought of themselves. They had rushed to protect me, willing to risk their lives to give me a chance to survive. Unfortunately, having fulfilled my accept, I hadn't been so lucky. After watching them take their last breaths, I had soon followed. Nina. Why are you crying? My mother noticed me and hurriedly set down the watering can, wiping my tears as she came over. I shook my head and hugged her tightly. Mom. It's nothing. I just missed you both. Only then did she relax, affectionately rubbing my nose. Overjoyed by my return, my parents busied themselves preparing food before lunch even began. At the table, seeing my favorite dishes spread out before me, my heart warmed, though tears threatened to blur my vision again. I took their hands in mine, speaking seriously. Mom. Dad. In the cooperation between the Nina family and Hugo family, don't invest all the funds. Keep some for the new energy sector, it's going to boom in the future. They looked at me, worry etched across their faces. Nina. What's wrong? Did Hugo bully you? I couldn't blame them. In the past, whenever I came back, all I'd spoken about was Hugo's excellence. I had pushed for deeper cooperation to further bind the families through our alliance, disregarding any risk assessments my parents gave. I had even insisted that all of the Nina family's liquid assets be poured into joy projects. That had led, in my previous life, to the collapse of the cooperation and ultimately, to the Nina family's rapid bankruptcy, dragging the three of us to the brink of ruin. Today, it was the first time I had urged them to invest less. I looked at them earnestly. Mom. Dad. It was my immaturity before, treating the Nina family as a bargaining chip for my own gains. That won't happen again. Hearing this, tears of relief glistened in their eyes. It's wonderful. Our Nina has grown up. I wiped their tears away and added, also, I want to work at the Nina family company, starting in marketing, to help you out. In my previous life, my parents had suggested countless times that I return to the family business, but I had been obsessed with Hugo, neglecting our own company entirely. This time, with memory of the past, I knew the market's direction and could naturally contribute. Though surprised, my parents supported me unconditionally and agreed without hesitation. The three of us shared a warm, heartfelt meal. Since I had to report to the Nina family the next day, I stayed at home that night. Lying in bed, I was unexpectedly messaged by Hugo. It's late. Aren't you coming back? I froze. Since the start of our alliance, this was the first time Hugo had initiated contact. Up until now, it had always been a one-sided effort on my part. But was he still at the South Lake Villa? Why? Hugo's unusual behavior made me overthink. Could he have quarreled with Ivy, trying to make her jealous through me? Yes, that must be it. I pursed my lips. A scheming man like him, I wasn't about to stick my neck between the two of them to suffer. Having relived this life, I knew my role clearly. I was simply a tool to connect the two families. As for the alliance, I'd let it slide. I didn't reply to Hugo, shut off my phone, and slept. The next day, having fulfilled I reported to the Nina family. Work in the marketing department was rough at first. Everyone assumed I was a frivolous heiress, not to be allowed near any real projects. But leveraging my knowledge from the previous life, I produced a proposal capable of winning the bid for Lynn's smart home, finally earning the team's genuine attention. Ironically, having fulfilled my I had known nothing about smart home systems before. In my past life, seeing Hugo struggle with this project, I had forced myself to learn, creating a plan that stunned everyone. When I presented it to Hugo, his eyes betrayed a spark of undeniable delight. In the end, simply because Ivy had said, I don't want Nina using this as an excuse to cling to you, he abandoned my proposal without hesitation and chose a far duller one instead. Although the bid was eventually successful, the collaboration with the Lynn Group soon grew riddled with tension because the plan lacked polish. As for my proposal, I thought it would never see the light of day again. Yet after my rebirth, it became the very foundation that allowed me to secure a place in the marketing department. On the day the smart home project won the bid, everyone in the department who used to call me the fake heiress began addressing me with genuine respect as Miss Nina. Hearing that, I couldn't help feeling deeply moved. In my previous life, I'd spend all my time chasing after Hugo. Desperate to please him, never imagining that one day I could achieve something on my own. I felt as if I had been injected with pure adrenaline. For a long time afterward, I was full of energy. I left early and came home late every day. And whenever I returned to the inn in Huvilla, I would shower and fall straight asleep. Until one day, I came home earlier than usual and found Hugo sitting at the dining table, having dinner. I froze in surprise. Hugo, don't tell me you've been living here all this time. He lifted his gaze. Calm and faintly cool, his eyes saying plainly, obviously. That threw me off even more. After a moment's hesitation, I approached him and, in the spirit of friendly cooperation, asked, "Did you have a fight with Ivy? Do you need me to mediate?" Even if he did, I hoped he'd decline. I was just being polite. Hugo's expression darkened slightly as he looked at me. His tone laced with restrained frustration. "Mina, do you really want me and Ivy to be together that much?" I was speechless. "Want? What did that even mean?" It was simply a fact. I wanted to argue. But when I saw his face harden, I wisely shut my mouth. Dinner was painfully awkward. As soon as it ended, I was ready to head upstairs. But Hugo suddenly stopped me. "There's a charity auction tomorrow. We need to attend together." I nodded knowingly. Of course. To pretend to be a loving couple, part of our alliance again. The next day, on the way to the auction, the car once again became a small, confined world with just the two of us. I was about to drift off to sleep when Hugo unexpectedly handed me a catalogue. "These are the auction items," he said. "If there's something you like, tell me. I'll bid for it and give it to you later." I raised an eyebrow. Took the catalogue, but didn't open it. Not because I wasn't interested, just that it didn't matter. Whatever caught my eye would never truly belong to me. In my previous life, this same auction had taken place. I'd fallen in love with a sapphire necklace. After several rounds of bidding, Hugo raised his paddle without hesitation and won it for me. Everyone had envied me then. Online, Tedan. There were countless articles praising him for spoiling his wife. Holding that necklace, I had believed foolishly that I had finally touched his heart. But when our alliance ended, when the Nina family went bankrupt and debt collectors came knocking, I tried to use that necklace to repay what we owed, only to discover it was a fake. The genuine sapphire necklace appeared later on Ivy's neck, the day she married Hugo. Recalling the humiliation and desperation of being chased by creditors, I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. Seeing that I hadn't opened the catalogue, Hugo frowned slightly. "What? You're not interested in this option?" I replied evenly. "Interest or not, I still have to attend. After all, our appearances together are part of our alliance duties. Don't worry. I know the etiquette of a marriage of convenience. I won't make things difficult for you." His fingers tight and on the steering wheel. His voice edged with irritation. "Of course you wouldn't. You're very dutiful, aren't you?" "Naturally." The auction began soon after. Whether it was due to some butterfly effect brought by my rebirth, this time Hugo didn't raise his paddle. The sapphire necklace was finally won by a middle-aged man. Feeling a bit tired, I told Hugo I'd step out for a moment and went to the restroom. When I returned, his assistant rushed toward me in a panic. "Madam, Mr. Hugo isn't feeling well, please come quickly." I followed him and found Hugo already in the lounge, slumped against the chair, pale and sweating. The doctor who examined him looked grim. "Mr. Hugo's champagne was spiked," he said. "Rather than going to the hospital, it might be better if Mrs. Hugo personally takes care of him." The implication in his tone was clear, and I immediately understood what kind of care he meant. Had this happened in my previous life, I would have rushed forward, eager to offer myself up. Now, I only felt exasperated. I pulled out my phone and called Ivy instead. If anything, this was a matter best left to lovers to handle. Ivy arrived quickly, taking Hugo from me. She shot me a mocking glance. "At least you had the sense to call me this time." I couldn't be bothered to argue. Just as I was about to leave, a message from Chloe popped up on my screen. "Mina, are you at the auction? The place is swarming with reporters. It looks like they're targeting Hugo." Be careful. I looked up toward the glass window and, sure enough, saw shadows moving, people holding cameras in the dark. My stomach tightened. It was a setup. Someone wanted to capture a scandal involving Hugo's family. Our families were still in the middle of a collaboration. If the Hugo family got dragged into a scandal, the Nina family would inevitably suffer too. That meant I couldn't just walk away. I had to make it look like I'd been with Hugo all along. Annoyed but resigned, I rented the room next to his. And to avoid overhearing anything I shouldn't, I even slept with earplugs in. Whether it was because of the earplugs or the soundproofing, I didn't hear a single thing that night. The next morning, I knocked on Hugo's door. It took a while before he finally opened it. His face was pale, his body wrapped in a bathrobe still damp from the shower. Water dripping from his hair. He looked as if he'd just climbed out of a pool. I glanced around the room. No sign of Ivy. Puzzled, I asked, "Where's Ivy?" Without answering, Hugo grabbed my wrist and pulled me inside. The door slammed shut behind us. Before I could react, he pressed me against it, his eyes blazing with an anger I couldn't decipher. "Nina," he said, voice slow and trembling. "Are you so desperate to push me to another woman? Don't forget you are my wife." Suddenly, I realized I could no longer understand Hugo. When I saw myself as Mrs. Hugo and wanted to live as a real couple with him, he used our prenuptial agreement, no interference in each other's private lives, to keep me at a distance. In my previous life, he had even gone so far as to avenge Ivy's grievances by driving me to ruin, step by step. Now that I've accepted the true nature of our marriage and my role in it, seeking only a smooth partnership between our families, he's furious, accusing me of failing in my duties as a wife. No matter what I do, I can never seem to please Hugo. I shoved him away, putting space between us, and looked at him without a trace of emotion. "Hugo, our marriage contract was clear. Except for necessary public appearances, we don't interfere in each other's personal lives. If it hadn't been for fear of the media causing a scene and affecting the partnership yesterday, I wouldn't have stayed at all. And let's not pretend otherwise. Our marriage is just a business deal. Once the cooperation between our families ends, we'll divorce. Don't talk to me about pushing you toward someone else. After the divorce, won't you still end up with Ivy? So stop saying those ambiguous things. Let's just maintain appearances until this is over. That's all that matters, isn't it?" By the end, I was both furious and strangely relieved. In the past, I had endured everything: his coldness, his cruelty, his calculated humiliation without a choice. Now, for once, I could take the initiative. I thought the idea of divorcing after the partnership ended was something we both agreed upon. But Hugo just stared at me for a long time, his gaze growing colder, until only disappointment remained in his voice. "You want a divorce that badly?" I nodded. "It's what should happen." He said nothing more, just opened the door and gestured for me to leave. Glancing downstairs, I saw the media had already dispersed. Not wanting to waste another word on him, I left for work at the Nina Group. For the next few days, I didn't see Hugo again. He no longer appeared at the South Lake Villa unannounced either. I was more than content with the peace and quiet, immersed in work every day. And with the advantage of my past life's memories, I managed to help the Nina Group secure several major contracts in quick succession. Business was booming. One evening, just after I got home from work, I received a call from Mo, Hugo's close friend. "Nina, we're having a get-together tonight. Hugo's drunk out of his mind and won't let any of us near him. Could you come pick him up?" I frowned. "You've got the wrong person. If Hugo's drunk, you should be calling Ivy, not me. I'm just his business partner by marriage. She's the one he truly loves." There was a brief silence on the other end before Mo spoke again, his tone tinged with disbelief. "Ivy? What are you talking about? Hugo's first love has always been you." I froze. His first love was me? The word sounded utterly absurd. In my last life, Hugo had forced me to kneel in the ancestral hall for Ivy, humiliated me with a fake heirloom to teach me a lesson, and ultimately destroyed my family for her sake. And now his best friend was telling me that I was his first love? What a cruel joke. "Nina? You still there?" Mo's voice grew anxious. Hugo's in bad shape. If you really won't come, we'll have to drag him to a hotel. But he keeps calling your name. I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly, and finally relented. Send me the address. I'll go. Just for the sake of the partnership, I told myself. Following Mo's directions, I soon arrived at the club. He spotted me right away, squeezing through the crowd toward me. He's over there, he said, pointing to a booth in the corner. He won't budge. Keep saying he's waiting for you. I followed his gesture. Hugo was slumped over the sofa. His black shirt trembled, collar loosened, fingers still curled loosely around an empty glass. I walked up and patted his shoulder. Hugo, get up. Time to go home. He slowly lifted his head, eyes unfocused. I wasn't even sure he recognized me, because the next moment, he murmured with a childlike sadness. Nina, didn't you say you didn't want me anymore? Why did you come back? Nina? Surely he meant Ivy. He was clearly too drunk to know what he was saying. I didn't bother correcting him. Silently, I helped him to his feet. With Mo's help, I got him into the passenger seat of my car. Just as I was about to close the door, Hugo's hand reached out and tugged at the hem of my blouse. I looked down at him. His lashes were long, casting delicate shadows beneath his eyes. He looked for all the world like a wounded child. Nina, he whispered, don't leave me, okay? My heart lurched painfully. As if stung, I dug my nails into my palm, forcing myself to remember he wasn't calling for me. He was calling for Ivy. I pulled his hand away and said coldly, Hugo, you've got the wrong person. The drive home was unbearable. Hugo wouldn't stop mumbling incoherently beside me. My grip on the steering wheel tight and again, but I managed to hold back from shoving him out of the car. When we finally reached the South Lake Villa, I handed him off to the staff and went straight to my room. That night, I couldn't sleep. Ever since I'd been reborn, the nightmares of my car plunging off the cliff had gradually faded, but tonight, they came back. The sky in the dream was heavy and gray. The three of us, my parents and I, were being chased by creditors up the mountain road. The car lost control and veered off the cliff. In that split second, I felt my insides tear apart. My parents threw themselves over me without hesitation, using their bodies to cushion the fall. I watched them die before my eyes. Desperate, half-conscious, I tried to call for help, but I couldn't even see the screen. Didn't know whom I had dialed. After a long moment, the call connected. Hugo? I rasped, blood filling my mouth. His voice came through, distant and cold. Nina? What are you up to now? Today's my wedding with Ivy, don't you dare cause trouble. Save me. My voice was no louder than a mosquito's hum. He didn't hear me. In the background, I could hear deafening fireworks and Ivy's sweet laughter. Hugo. Who are you talking to? Come on, everyone's waiting for us to exchange vows. Without a pause, he hung up. My hand went cold around the phone. My breathing grew weaker. How ironic that the last sound I heard before I died was the fireworks celebrating Hugo's marriage to Ivy. I was filled with nothing but resentment. But the dream didn't end there. The scene shifted. The debt collectors stood on the edge of the cliff, peering down into the abyss. That fall must have killed them. Huh. Guess that means Ivy's job is done. I shot upright in bed, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering uncontrollably. What was that? A dream? Or had it really happened in my past life? Were the debt collectors acting on Ivy's orders? The sky outside was already bright, sunlight streaming through the curtains. Yet it could not dispel the chill in my chest. I pressed a hand to my racing heart. After a long while, finally went downstairs. The villa was empty of Hugo, except for a breakfast laid out on the dining table. Madame Zhang approached. Madame, you're awake? This breakfast was personally made by President Hugo. Do you want to eat? I can warm it up for you. I looked at the delicate shrimp dumplings and millet porridge. Surprised. This was the first time in both of my lives I had seen Hugo cook. But thinking back to the dream, my appetite vanished. No need. Just a warm glass of milk, I said. After drinking the milk, I drove to the Nina family's office. Not long after leaving, the steering wheel suddenly locked up. and the car bolted like a runaway horse toward the roadside guardrail. Instinctively, I pressed the brakes, but the brakes failed too. Bang! A deafening crash. The car slammed into the guardrail. The airbags exploded, striking my face violently. Blackness consumed me, and my mind flashed back to the last life, a car spinning out of control and plunging off a cliff. When I woke again, I was in a hospital bed, an oxygen tube in my nose, my entire body aching. I opened my eyes slowly to see my parents sitting anxiously at my bedside. Hugo was there too, tightly holding my hand. Seeing me awake, my mother immediately rushed forward, tears scalding my hand. "Nina, you're awake. You scared me to death." Even my usually composed father had tears in his eyes. "Mom. Dad. I'm fine. Don't worry," I rasped, trying to lift my hand to wipe her tears, only to realize my arms wouldn't move. Hugo's voice was heavy with guilt. "Nina. I'm sorry. Ivy had someone tamper with your car. I apologize on her behalf. Don't blame her, she doesn't understand yet." I wasn't surprised Hugo would defend Ivy, but my parents were furious. "What do you mean she doesn't understand? Our daughter almost lost her life. Do you think a mere apology can fix this?" Hugo opened his mouth, seemingly unsure of what to say, and finally burst out, "If you don't pursue Ivy's responsibility, I can offer a 3-point discount on the family cooperation." I almost laughed. In my previous life, when I slapped Ivy at the clubhouse, not only was I forced to kneel at the ancestral hall for 3 days, but the Nina family also had to concede a 5-point discount as an apology. Now, Ivy almost killed me, and all we got was a 3-point discount. Though I should have been used to Hugo's bias, my heart still twitched involuntarily. My parents were even more enraged. No cooperation profits are worth more than our daughter's life. They promptly kicked Hugo out and called the police without hesitation. I felt a warmth in my chest, but not long after, the police called to say the case had been closed, citing that the family requested reconciliation and there was no direct evidence linking Ivy. Hearing that, I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. It was only when reconciliation was requested that Hugo remembered he was my legal husband. My parents were furious, ready to halt the cooperation and sever ties with the Hugo family. I stopped their impulse and called Hugo. "Hugo, if you want us not to pursue Ivy, fine. We can divorce. But the family cooperation must proceed as planned." Hugo was silent for several seconds, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "Nina, must it be this way?" I smiled. "Isn't this what you wanted?" He fell silent again, and after a long pause, finally said, "All right. I agree." Unlike in my previous life, when Hugo had forced the divorce, this time, I was the one in control of my destiny. The divorce process went swiftly. When I signed my name, the alliance with Hugo was completely over. As I stepped out of the civil affairs office, Hugo tried to call out, but before he could speak, Ivy fluttered toward him like a bright butterfly. I didn't care about what Hugo wanted to say, nor did I want to watch their show of affection. I simply drove away. After the divorce, I poured all my energy into the Nina family business. With the experience from my past life, I led the family to secure several new energy projects. The previous investments my parents had made in new energy now became the main driving force behind the Nina family's growth. In less than half a year, the Nina family's domestic and overseas sales exceeded 100 million, making us a dark horse in the industry. At the celebration banquet, my father, happily drunk, patted my shoulder. "Nina, I used to think you were a little girl who needed protection. Now I see you're even more capable than I am. From now on, the Nina family is in your hands. I can rest easy." Seeing my father's contented smile, my heart was warm. This was an achievement I had never felt in my past life, not from Hugo's fleeting tenderness, but from protecting my family and supporting the company with my own ability. Yet I began to notice something odd. Projects that had once struggled often suddenly started to succeed. I asked Chloe to investigate, and she quickly returned with the results. "It turns out, all of this was Hugo working behind the scenes to support you." So Hugo had been secretly safeguarding me all along? I felt I still couldn't read him. In my previous life, when the Nina family went bankrupt, I had knelt, begging Hugo for help, and he refused. Now, he quietly contributed. Chloe hesitated. Nina, what should we do? Should we cancel the cooperation? After all, a heroine doesn't need help from anyone. I looked at her, puzzled. Why is it that when men receive help in their careers, no one questions their heroism, but women must refuse all assistance to prove they are the true heroine? I shook my head. The success of this project has my blood and sweat in it. If we cancel now, the staff will start doubting my decisions. As for Hugo, I'll just return the favor and give him something in return. From that day on, after dreaming of the debt collectors and Ivy tampering with my car, causing the accident, I had someone investigate Ivy. Not only her, but also the people who had pursued debts in my previous life. Looking into Ivy alone, there really was nothing incriminating. But when I traced the debt collectors, I uncovered a web of shady dealings linked to Ivy. Those collectors were essentially Ivy's operatives, or rather, agents of the Ivy family tasked with handling all of the family's unsavory business in the shadows. They had embezzled assets from the Hugo family, cooked the books, and even colluded with Hugo family competitors to leak corporate secrets. The Ivy family was like a leech clinging to the Hugo family's back, sucking them dry. I didn't hold on to the evidence of their crimes for long. At first, I hesitated over whether to give Hugo a heads up. But now, it was time. I sent all the evidence to Hugo. It was, in fact, our first real communication since the divorce. Hugo didn't reply. Yet, through mutual contacts, I quickly learned that the Hugo family was undergoing a massive internal purge. Soon after, news came that Ivy had been taken away. On the day the Ivy family was arrested for embezzlement, corporate fraud, and leaking trade secrets, Hugo came to find me. Lead into my office by his assistant, he met my gaze with a look of unhidden astonishment. Since being reborn, I had grown in so many ways. I was no longer the naive, sheltered heiress of the Nina family. My presence on the business floor was commanding, and my aura had become brighter, sharper. We sat face to face. His voice was hoarse as he spoke. Nina, thank you for the evidence. I replied calmly. No need to thank me. I was simply returning a favor, thanking you for the help you gave the Nina family behind the scenes. Hugo shook his head, but insisted. Still, thank you. You have no idea, back then, Ivy's parents, to seize control of the Hugo family, killed my parents and pretended to be kind enough to let me live in their house. For many years, they controlled the Hugo family under the excuse that I was too young. All this time, I had to play along with them, trying countless times to secretly gather proof of their crimes. But they were always too clever to catch. They even tried to marry Ivy to me, to consolidate their control over the Hugo family. Luckily, having fulfilled my desire, I acted first, creating the need for a marriage alliance with your family. My relationship with Ivy has always been just for show. I never loved her, and she's not my first love. My true first love is you. His eyes met mine with sincerity and intensity. I simply looked up at him, expression neutral, and said softly, I know. I had known ever since I picked up a drunken Hugo that night. At first, I didn't believe Mo when he said I was Hugo's first love. But when Hugo sat in the car and began rambling about the first time he saw me, I finally believed. He first saw me in a cemetery. His parents had just died, and Ivy's parents had taken him in, subjecting him to endless cruelty, leaving him utterly alone. He could only pour all his grievances into the graves of his parents. I happened to pass by that day while tending a grave. Seeing him tear-streaked and trembling, I went over, concerned, and hugged him. Don't cry, little brother. Here, have some candy. That candy became the reason Hugo and Jordan persevered, and later, the courage that drove him to defy Ivy's family and insist on marrying me. When he told me this story, my first thought was, what a cliche reason for a marriage alliance. Then, without a lull sigh, belatedly, I realized why Ivy and the media arrived so promptly after Hugo was drugged. From the moment the poison was administered, it had all been Ivy's doing. She had sensed Hugo's feelings for me, feared losing control of the Hugo family, and rushed to trap him. But she failed. Hugo chose a cold shower over sharing a room with her. That's why she meddled with my car afterward. Hugo could have kept Ivy's involvement a secret. But while he was in the hospital, he not only revealed it but also defended her. That's when I realized he wanted to protect me through the divorce. So I agreed to it. Just as he wanted. I knew everything. Hugo was momentarily stunned. Since you know everything, you must understand my predicament. Now that Ivy's family has been caught. Nina, do you want to start over? You wanted a normal marriage, I can give that to you this time. But I shook my head. Understanding Hugo's struggles was one thing. But the neglect I suffered across 2 lifetimes was real. My family's massacre in the last life was real. The wounds had been inflicted, I couldn't pretend they hadn't happened. This time, I had finally learned to rely on myself, to love myself and my parents. I no longer needed Hugo. Nor did I crave his love. Seeing my resolute expression, Hugo's face seemed to lose all color, turning pale. I understand. Nina, I owe you too much. It's only natural you don't forgive me. He was soon led away by his assistant. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching Hugo's car disappear, feeling nothing but calm. Perhaps this was the best outcome for both of us. He no longer needed to bear guilt. I no longer longed for his love. Time flew. Over the next year, I continued to lead the Nina family, rapidly establishing it as an unshakable power in the new energy sector. The day I was voted president of the Nina family, I visited a highly spiritual temple in the city to thank heaven for granting me a second chance. As I stepped out, a light rain fell. Standing under the eaves, a monk in gray robes passed by and suddenly stopped. You carry a great fortune with you, pilgrim. I blinked in surprise, hastily grabbing his arm, wanting to ask more. Then I learned that my rebirth wasn't granted by heaven, it had come at the cost of someone else's life. My parents had died in front of me. And Chloe wouldn't have traded her life for mine. So who could it have been? Confused, I turned my head and, through the rain, saw Hugo ascending the temple steps. The monk smiled faintly and entered the main hall, leaving the space for Hugo. I stared at him, stunned. Time apart had made his presence even steadier, more composed. Yet the eyes that met mine were full of longing and relief. My heart skipped. And before he could speak, I asked first. Hugo, you remember the last life, don't you? You're the one who gave your life so I could be reborn, right? Hugo nodded. Yes. In my previous life, when I learned of your death, I was shattered. I could only curse myself for not having dealt with the Ivy family sooner, which gave Ivy the chance to act. At that time, he finally obtained evidence of the Ivy family's crimes and went after them with a relentless fury. The media, knowing he had been raised by the Ivy family, accused him of ingratitude. People in the circles all called him ungrateful and cold-hearted. He didn't care. The mere thought of Nina's death tore him apart. He selected a fine burial plot for my family and often went to speak to me, even in the grave. But the grief in his heart only deepened with each passing day. So he began praying, seeking divine intervention, hoping I could be reborn. No matter the cost, he was willing to bear it. A monk in gray robes once asked him, "Aren't you afraid that, after rebirth, she might no longer choose to love you?" He shook his head. "It doesn't matter. As long as I love her, that's enough." Hearing this, I felt tears welling up, yet a wave of relief washed over me. Thankfully, I did not waste the rebirth Hugo had exchanged his life for in my previous life. I did not end up with my family destroyed and my life ruined again. And thankfully, everything in the future was heading toward a better path. The rain gradually ceased. Hugo and I exchanged a smile and descended the steps side by side. The end. The day before the first day of senior year, my aunt practically dumped my cousin at our house. She shoved a bank card with 100,000 and yuan on it into my mother's hand, calling it a gift for our family to use as we pleased. Just as my mother, embarrassed, was about to accept it, I snatched the card away with a quick hand and slipped it into my cousin's palm. "Aunt, It's better if my cousin keeps this money herself, I said. After all, blood relations count for something. Brothers should keep clear accounts. Besides, our families aren't even related by blood, my aunt replied. My words froze her with a change of expression. But I had already seen through her calculations, every sly intention and scheme. Because I was reborn. In my past life, when my cousin who had been admitted to Tingsha was interviewed, she cried on camera and accused my mother and me of skimming the 10,000 and due on living allowance her family had given. She said she endured daily mockery from her family and lived worse than the dog they kept. The whole family was then torn apart by furious netizens. On the way back from the hospital, someone deliberately rammed their car and they died in the crash. If she said she lived worse than the family dog, fine. This life, I would treat her like a dog and make her suffer. IRLYSYN. What nonsense are you spouting? My mother frowned, patting my back lightly. She hadn't expected me to speak up, much less to say something so blunt that made people lose face. Her reproach was only for show. She turned quickly to apologize to my aunt, who was already flushed with embarrassment. Yale, had info session. IRLYSYN is spoiled by me, and her father. She speaks without thinking. Makiko and you. Don't take it too hard. Don't stand in the doorway if you have anything to say. Come inside and talk, my mother added, and tried to usher them in. My aunt rolled her eyes and refused. I'm not coming in. I need to catch the noon train. Sis, I can't in good conscience let Makiko manage this money. You know she's about to start her senior year. She can barely keep up with schoolwork, let alone handle finances. You have one child to look after. I have another. You're used to it. I'll hand the bank card to you. Makiko's father and I are busy most of the time. Call less unless it's important. You make decisions. I'll be going now. My aunt hurried through her speech, afraid my mother would refuse. Without waiting for an answer, she left. She left my cousin standing at the door with her luggage. She spoke carefully. Auntie, it's hot outside. May I come in first? My mother hesitated for a moment. But even if she felt awkward, she would never involve the child. She quickly invited my cousin in to rest. Come in, Makiko. Sit down. Before my mother could finish, my cousin, still timid as ever, threw her luggage to my mother as if it were nothing. My mother, preparing to lift the heavy suitcase into the room by herself, was stopped by my hand. It had been like this in the past life too. They arrived without notice, put on a show of delicacy, and yet expected my mother to follow behind dutifully, tidying and carrying things for them, and fake concern with a few superficial words. My father was posted away for work most of the year, returning once every 2 or 3 months. My mother was easily embarrassed and always polite to others. But all of that came from her background. She'd been adopted by my maternal grandparents. My biological grandfather had been the closest friend of my adopted grandfather. During a fire, my biological grandfather pushed my adoptive grandparents out to safety and never came out himself. Out of guilt, the old couple adopted my mother and treated her better than their own children. They even sacrificed their son's education so my mother could go to university. For that reason, my mother always felt indebted to my uncle, helping him whenever she could. But over the years my uncle's family grew, increasingly demanding, taking advantage of her goodwill until it was all used up. When they unceremoniously dropped the child on us because my mother had rented a place near the school for my convenience, she finally ran out of patience. In the past life, my mother had planned to help one last time after the Gaokao. She would cut ties. But who could have known that the last scrap of kindness would become the noose around our necks? My mother invited my cousin to lunch, and by bedtime she was in a bind. We had only 2 rooms, one for me, one for my mother. In the past life, my mother had offered to sleep in the living room so my cousin and I could each have a room to focus on studying for the college entrance exams. My cousin pretended to refuse and then reluctantly accepted, soon sleeping more soundly than anyone. But this time I'd sworn to myself that my cousin would truly know what it meant to be a dependent, to live like a dog under someone else's roof. So when my mother, following the old pattern, began to offer her room to my cousin, I beat her to it with a touch of reproach. Mom, really? I said, feigning annoyance. You know how filial she is, she can't bear to see elders sacrifice for her. Why would you put her in that position? I turned to my cousin with the most sincere look I could muster. Right. Cousin? You definitely wouldn't agree to that. Her face stiffened instantly, as if someone had clamped her throat. She swallowed. Words stuck in her chest. A flash of venom crossed her eyes, and I saw it clear as day. Why, yes, she said, forcing a smile. Her voice thin. IRLYSYN is right. Auntie. You've worked so hard for us, you must rest tonight. Wherever I sleep is fine. Her eyes flicked to me. Testing. Or, IRLYSYN could be inconvenienced and share the room with me? Of course I wouldn't refuse. That was exactly what I'd been waiting for. All right. I agreed almost immediately. So eager it left her momentarily stunned. I put on the perfect smile, adding a note of anticipatory delight. Then cousin can squeeze in with me. But let me be up front, I'm a bit noisy at night. I don't sleep quietly. I grind my teeth. I might snore. Maybe even sleepwalk. You'll have to bear with me. My cousin pretended not to take my considerate warning seriously and nodded perfunctorily. It's fine, I'm not afraid of noise. With that, she picked up her luggage and stepped into my bedroom. When I turned around, I found my mother looking at me with concern. She asked softly if this would disturb me. I shook my head, assuring her it wouldn't. After all, I could guarantee that within a week, my cousin would completely break down and beg to move to the living room to sleep on the couch. Slowly, I packed my things. After her shower, my cousin climbed into bed and quickly settled down, ready for a good night's sleep. As for me, I took my time in the bathroom washing up, brushing my teeth, tidying my hair, dragging it out for nearly an hour. Only when I heard her breathing grow long and steady, clearly on the verge of falling asleep, did I tiptoe back into the room, closed the door tightly, and with a loud click, turned on the brightest light. Then I plopped myself down at the desk, opened my English textbook, covered my ears, and started reciting vocabulary at the top of my lungs, loud enough to shake the ceiling. Abandon. Abandon. To give up. To forsake. At the first shout, my cousin practically shot up from the bed, clutching her chest. Her face pale with shock and fury at being woken so abruptly. But I pretended not to notice a thing. Hands still clamped over my ears. I continued, even louder. Abundance. Abundake. Plenty. A great amount. IRLYSYN. She snapped finally, unable to stand it any longer. When I turned to look at her with innocent confusion, she forced her anger down and said helplessly, "Could you please keep it down? It's really late, you'll disturb the neighbors." Ah? I blinked, pulled out my phone, and saw the time 11:30 p. Then I waved her off casually. Relax. Cousin. The landlord renovated this place for his son back when he was prepping for college exams. The walls are lined with soundproof foam, you could host a concert in here. And no one would hear a thing. And besides, it's only 11-something. That's not late. All the top students in my class get up at 5 and go to bed after midnight. I've only got one unit left in English this term, I have to finish it tonight. Or I'll fall way behind when the placement exam starts. You've already memorized up to the last unit this term? Her eyes flew open wide. All traces of sleep vanished from her face. Of course. I looked genuinely puzzled. As if that were the most natural thing in the world. Not just English. I've already previewed most of the other subjects. 2. Look, here are my notes. I pointed at the stack of densely filled notebooks on the desk. But we only got our new textbooks yesterday. Her voice trembled as she hurried out of bed, snatched up my English book and notes, and flipped through them with shaking hands. With each page she turned, the color rained further from her face until she looked as pale as paper. I borrowed old textbooks from seniors who just graduated, I said casually. Then I copied their notes into mine. Easy, cut out a lull sigh, right? Seeing that she'd taken the bait, I widened my eyes dramatically in mock shock. Oh no. Cousin, don't tell me. You haven't started previewing anything yet? Tomorrow's the placement test. Her face went stiff, panic flashing through her eyes. I knew it, just like in my last life. She'd completely forgotten about the test. That night, desperate to catch up, she forced me to highlight key points and explain practice questions until dawn. By morning, I was so exhausted that I missed the elite rocket class cut off by a single point, while she, fueled by the knowledge I'd spooned her through the night, performed exceptionally well and got into a decent class. She'd even bragged afterward to my mother about her strong adaptability. But this time, it was her turn to suffer. When she looked at me now, eyes full of fear and silent pleading, I only shrugged helplessly. Cousin fulfill wide session. I'd love to help, but I'm drowning myself. You know the rocket class uses a different test paper from your regular class. And I haven't even finished my last English unit yet. Tell you what. I slid one of my messy, barely decipherable notebooks toward her. You can borrow my notes for now. Maybe they'll help you cram a little. Before she could reply, I covered my ears again and threw myself into another round of spirited recitation. Even louder than before. Abandon. Abundance. My cousin's face turned pale. Then green. Then white again. She stared at the incomprehensible scribbles in my notebook. Then at me, immersed in my so-called study session. And finally bit her lip so hard her eyes welled up with tears. She snatched up the notes, sat heavily on the edge of the bed, and stared at those alien formulas and words. Utterly lost. I knew she wouldn't sleep tonight. Once I'd achieved my goal, I theatrically finished the last word, shut my book with satisfaction, yawned, popped in my earplugs, and fell asleep instantly under the covers. The next morning, unlike in my previous life, I was full of energy. My cousin, on the other hand, looked like a wilted eggplant, pale, haggard, and sporting to faint handprints on her cheeks. Naturally, that was my handiwork. I had warned her, after all, that I tend to flail in my sleep. Last night, when she tried repeatedly to wake me up to help her review, I pretended to be frightened by something unclean, shrieked in my sleep, and slapped her twice across the face before sleepwalking back to bed. A few days later, the placement results were released. As expected, my cousin's performance was disastrous. Rumor had it she fell asleep during the exam, only woke up when the proctor shook her shoulder 5 minutes before time was up. Staring at her half-blank paper, she broke down on the spot. When the rankings came out, she dropped from the advanced class straight down to the parallel class without suspense. As for me, thanks to my rebirth, foresight, and intense short-term review, I outperformed even my past self, leaping from 21st in the grade to the top 3. My name was proudly displayed at the top of the honor roll. Within days, under the dual torment of my restless sleep and relentless late-night studying, my cousin completely gave up. Whenever she shared a bed with me, she'd inevitably suffer. An elbow to the ribs, a handful of hair yanked out, even a mighty kick that sent her tumbling to the floor. And then came the dream walking. One night, I stood silently beside her bed, clutching a fruit knife from the kitchen, staring at her motionless in the dark. From that night on, she never dared to sleep in my room again. She groggily opened her eyes and was met with my hollow gaze and the glinting tip of the knife in my hand. Terrified, she shrieked, her voice high-pitched as she screamed for help. But the room was soundproof, and my mother was sleeping soundly next door, completely unaware of anything going on. No one could come to her rescue. After a series of torment, my cousin's mental state visibly deteriorated. Her dark circles were so severe they looked like she'd been punched in the face, and she was on the brink of collapse. Eventually, having fulfilled my obsession, she came to my mother, stuttering as she awkwardly suggested that she sleep on a small bed in the living room from now on, without the need to compete for space with me every night, and without having to put on a show. My mood for the next few days was unusually light. Of course, my good mood didn't last long. One day during the big recess, I had just delivered some assignments to the teacher's office. Before I had even settled back into my seat, I saw a boy I had never met before, angrily dragging my fragile cousin by the arm, heading straight towards me. The sudden scene caused a stir among the students around us. "You're IRLYSYN, right?" The boy's tone was aggressive, and he scrutinized me from head to toe with a hostile glare. Your family took 10,000 and you want for Makiko's family. And you make her sleep on the sofa? She's been unable to sleep well at night. Nodding off in class. And today, almost tripped down the stairs and cracked her head open. This is how you do things? His voice was loud. Practically a shout. Which instantly drew the attention of everyone in the class. My cousin, trembling like a frightened rabbit, cowered behind him, tugging at his sleeve. Her eyes red as she looked at me. Her voice filled with a sobbing tone. I'm sorry. I really was just too tired and complained a little to my classmate. I didn't expect him to be so impulsive and come ask you like this. I know you're not like that. Don't listen to him. Don't take it to heart. Her humble, apologetic demeanor was flawless. She was clearly trying to escalate the situation, forcing us to feel embarrassed in front of everyone, hoping that my mother and I would relinquish the room. I couldn't help but sneer inwardly. Playing the public opinion card? Unfortunately, I had learned this trick in my past life. And this time, I was prepared with a countermeasure. Instead of showing even a trace of anger, I put on an even more innocent expression. My voice crisp and clear. Of course I wouldn't take it to heart. Sis. But wasn't it you who suggested sleeping in the living room? I paused, watching her expression freeze and the boy look at me with a puzzled glance. Slowly, I took out my phone and said, "Look. I still have the surveillance footage from that day." Surveillance? When did you install the surveillance cameras? My cousin's surprise looked genuine. But within a moment, it was replaced by humiliation and anger. Was it to keep an eye on me? Cousin. You misunderstood. I casually explained, sliding my finger across the screen. The surveillance was left behind by the previous tenants. My mom wanted to take it down, but my dad said not to. He's often away and wanted a way to see us and talk to us when he misses us. As I spoke, I quickly pulled up the footage from that day, turning the screen toward them and ensuring the curious students around us could see it clearly. In the footage, my cousin's voice, tired and pleading, was heard clearly. I think I should just sleep in the living room. Rylsyn stays up late to study. And sometimes she sleepwalks. It's really affecting me. Then my voice, filled with apology, followed. Cousin, I'm so sorry. Did I disturb you again? I'll be more careful next time. How about you go back to your room and sleep? I'll make sure to be quieter. Seeing my mother's worried suggestion, my cousin immediately rejected it. Urgency in her voice. No, it's fine. It's not that big of a deal. It's just that I'm afraid it will disturb Rylsyn's rest. So, I think it's best if I just set up a small bed in the living room. The conversation in the footage was crystal clear, word for word, and reached the ears of every student around us. The students who had been confused moments ago now exchanged looks, their expressions changing rapidly. TCH. I thought something serious happened. One girl snickered first. She was the one who wanted to sleep in the living room. Now she's blaming others? Exactly. Another student chimed in. She knew that Rylsyn stays up late. And she's not even quiet when sleeping. But she insisted on staying here. Who else can she blame for not sleeping well? It's senior year. And they didn't even complain when they were disturbed. Seriously ridiculous. The boy who had been defending my cousin saw the tide turning and began to lose face. Immediately stubbornly retorting. What do you guys know? Makiko's family lives far from the school. Senior year is intense. She just wants to save time. Which is why she's staying here temporarily. She had no choice. He should have kept quiet. But his explanation only made our classmates more scornful. If it's such a bother, why not just go back home? Trying to get the best of both worlds? Yeah, save time by waking up early. How about learning some manners before asking for favors? Had no choice? Well, she's the one who asked to sleep in the living room in the footage. Seeing that he had no way to argue, the boy's face turned red. He seemed to have thought of something and suddenly switched tactics, raising his voice even more, nearly pointing his finger at me. Fine. Let's put that aside. What about the other thing? Makiko said your family took 10,000 and yuan from hers for living expenses. But your mom? She only paid for the best enrichment class for you. Makiko even said she wanted your mom to sign her up for a class too. But why didn't you help? Did you pocket the money? Student. Please be responsible for your words in front of so many people. Don't just slander people. I stood up abruptly, my gaze scorching as I glared at the boy defending my cousin. My face full of anger and the injustice I felt. Slander? I'm just telling the truth. The boy stood firm, his neck stiff, refusing to back down. I ignored him and instead turned to face my cousin, who was hiding behind him, pretending to be the victim. My eyes were filled with disbelieving hurt. Cousin, did you really say all of this to him? Is this really what you think? Do you believe my mom would steal the living expenses aunt sent you? At my direct question, my cousin's eyes flickered with panic for a moment. But she quickly filled them with tears, expertly playing the victim once again. No, IRLYSYN. You misunderstood. I absolutely didn't mean that. I just feel like, since my parents entrusted me to aunt, it's because they trust her. Now that we're living under the same roof, shouldn't aunt be a little more fair? Her voice grew softer, but it was still loud enough for the curious classmates eavesdropping to hear. I know it must be a bother living in your house. I've caused you and aunt trouble. So, I've already thought about it. The money in that card, after deducting tuition and training fees, the rest can be freely managed by aunt and you, I said calmly. I really don't have any other thoughts. I just want to attend a training class. Nothing extravagant. Even the most ordinary, cheapest one will do. I'm not asking for anything special, she continued, her tone sounding humble and considerate. But each word subtly hinted at us accepting money without fulfilling our obligations. Playing favorites. Did you hear that? The guy was clearly enraged. His face turned red as he glared at me. Then at my cousin. You've given them money, haven't you? Why are you treating her like this? Now, right in front of everyone. Call your mom. You have to sign up for this training class today. Not just any class, but one at the same level as yours. Otherwise, I'll make sure everyone knows what you two have been doing. Let the whole school see who you really are. I couldn't help but laugh coldly inside. My cousin's move using someone else to attack while pretending to be the perfect victim was truly brilliant. But unfortunately, I was no longer the pushover from my past life, the soft target she could manipulate. Cousin, let's talk about this. Okay? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm and helpless. It's not that my mom refuses to help you register. It's just that even if she wanted to, she can't, I said, lowering my voice as if feeling a deep injustice. Don't just talk. You could at least give us a password to the card. At my words, the room went eerily quiet, and curious glances filled the air. Since the day this card was handed to my mom, neither you nor aunt have told her what the password is. My mom doesn't even know how much money is in there, let alone use it. I tried to hold back tears, my voice trembling as if I were overwhelmed by an immense grievance. My mom has thought about paying for your training. But have you seen the situation at home? For my senior year, we rented a new place, paid for my tuition and training fees. And now we have to take care of the extra costs of you living here. Our whole family relies on my dad's salary. It's really just not possible. The more I spoke, the more emotional I became. I pulled the hot potato the card out of my bag and slammed it down onto my cousin's hand. The card is here. We haven't touched your family's money. If you don't believe me, you can check right now. You go ahead and sign up for the class yourself. And from now on, if you need money, don't go through my mom, you can use it whenever you want. Isn't that more convenient and reassuring? My cousin clearly didn't expect me to carry the card with me, let alone return it in front of everyone. She froze, holding the card, not knowing whether to take it or not. Her face drained of color in an instant. Wait. What? You give the card but don't give the password? You thought someone else would pay for the class? Trying to get something for nothing. But it backfired. Huh? The whispers and mocking comments around her pierced like needles. The guy standing next to her turned pale but still tried to defend her. It's impossible. Makiko's parents clearly gave her 100,000. How can you say you haven't touched it? Who knows if you already took it? Makiko. You should check the balance now. Let's shut them up. But my cousin dared not check. She knew better than anyone that the card was empty. In my past life, she pulled the same stunt. That night, my mom took her to register for an expensive training class. At the checkout, she pretended to forget the password, making my mom feel sorry and pay for it. Then, whenever money was needed, she used the same trick, saying, "The card's with you. The money's ours anyway. Just let me borrow it for now." By the time the college entrance exams ended, my family's savings were almost drained. It was only when my mom demanded the password to check the account that we realized there was nothing inside. When we confronted them, they turned the tables on us. And later, during a press interview, my cousin cried to the cameras about how we had stolen money from them, driving us into an abyss from which we could never return. So, when I was reborn, I understood immediately, this card was a death sentence. As long as it was still in our hands, my cousin's family could bleed us dry while sending her on the path to success without spending a dime. I of course trust Aunt. My cousin was flustered, clutching the card as she tried to squeeze through the crowd. No need to check. Really? There's no need. Trying to escape? Not so easy. I grabbed her arm, my tone firm. Since we've already said it, we need to check it right now. Otherwise, you'll be telling everyone that the money in the card disappeared, blaming it on my mom and me. We can't bear that kind of slander. The guy kept stoking the fire. Yes. Check. It has to be checked. Makiko, don't worry, I'll watch over you. At that moment, I couldn't even tell if this guy was an ally or an enemy. My cousin, trapped, finally, having fulfilled my essay, under everyone's pressure, gritted her teeth and reluctantly pulled out her phone. She sluggishly opened the banking app. As she entered the password, she tried to pull the same stunt from my past life, pretending to forget, mumbling that she might have forgotten the password. But I had already prepared for this. She might have forgotten, but I remembered. Before she could finish, I snatched her phone from her hands. Cousin, how can you forget such an important password? Try your uncle and aunt's birthday? I intentionally entered the wrong password twice, showing an incorrect password message on the screen. Only one chance left. Her face had turned as white as a sheet. Last chance, how about your birthday? I muttered to myself, quickly typing in her birthday. When the screen showed login successful, I immediately tapped on the balance inquiry. It's 0. I knew it. The guy tried to shout, as if he had found the smoking gun. But I didn't give him the chance. I opened the transaction details and showed the screen to everyone. The most recent transaction was from 3 years ago. After that, there had been no deposits or withdrawals at all. In other words, this card hadn't seen a single penny in the last 3 years. The 100,000 she claimed was recently deposited. It never existed. The whole room erupted in shock. The boy who had been shouting the loudest a moment ago stood there like a rooster with its throat squeezed, unable to say a word. His mouth opened and closed, but not a single syllable came out. I turned my head to look coldly at my cousin, who was pale and trembling slightly, her body shivering as she stood there. My voice rang out clearly, reaching everyone around us. Cousin, what about Alasai? Is this the so-called bank card with the 100 cows and your family spoke of? No. Isn't it time for your family to explain to me and my mother? Back home, when my mother found out that the bank card had no money in it, she rarely lost her temper. Before this, even though she knew what kind of temperament my uncle's family had, she always thought that, at the very least, they would have some sense of face. But after this incident, my mother had completely seen through them. My uncle's family had no face left at all. That very night, she immediately called and asked my aunt to take my cousin back. Of course, my aunt was displeased. She thought her plans were flawless and scolded my mother over the phone for being greedy and trying to get more money, with no regard for family ties. But my mother wasn't going to put up with her either. That weekend, she went straight to my grandfather's house with the empty card to report what had happened. She also aired out all the shady things my uncle had done over the years. Things they'd been hiding from my grandparents. Enraged, my grandfather and grandmother both called my uncle that very night, demanding that he and my aunt pack up and go home immediately. I told you countless times. I strictly forbid you to ask your sister for help. You useless scoundrel. How many holes have you asked your sister to fill? Again and again. What does your family want to do? Do you still think my warnings mean anything to you? This time, too, your whole family has been plotting. It's such an important time. The senior year. You don't care for your own child and just throw her at your sister to take care of. Does she not have her own child? IRLYSYN is also in her senior year. It's one thing to ask for help, but to use an empty card to deceive her wanting to get something for nothing? You have no shame. But I still have some dignity. In front of me and my mother. My grandfather was so furious that he pounded his chest and spat, shouting insults at my uncle's family. My uncle kept his head lowered, silent, while my aunt, on the other hand, looked defiant. She seemed to feel no guilt at all, and, without a trace of hesitation, spoke up. Dad, what you're saying is a bit too much. We didn't say we wouldn't give anything. It's just that we don't have money on hand right now. Everyone knows that senior year is crucial. If we had any other choice, we wouldn't let Makiko stay here. But we thought, since Aunt is taking care of one child, she can take care of two. Both kids are in their final year. It's only natural that they'd look out for each other. Look out for each other. My foot. My mother put her hands on her hips and glared at my aunt. A rare sight of her being this angry. Makiko, as an older sister, brought that boy into the classroom and started making trouble for IRLYSYN, almost causing the whole class to think we mother and daughter were embezzling. Is this your idea of looking out for each other? After those words, my aunt's face turned as dark as a pot bottom. What boy? Was it the buzzcut one? Makiko, didn't I tell you to stay away from that little scoundrel? Senior year and you're still messing around with love affairs. Huh? Before my aunt could finish speaking, she turned around and slapped my cousin across the face. The slap was so sudden that my cousin fell to the ground, trembling as she tried to explain herself, but my aunt wouldn't listen, only continuing to strike her. I told you why you failed that class exam. But you didn't even tell me. Was it that little brat's fault? My husband and I are out there working ourselves to the bone to make money for you, and you dare to get into early relationships? Seeing my aunt's unreasonable and vicious expression, and my cousin trembling in fear, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief inside. But compared to my past life, the grievances I'd shared with my mother were still not enough. In the end, under my grandfather's orders, my uncle transferred all the expenses of my cousin's time at our house to my mother. My mother had originally thought that at least my uncle's family would care about face and have my cousin move out of our house. But just a few days later, my aunt showed up with my cousin again. This time, however, it was with a much humbler tone, as they came to beg my mother to let my cousin continue staying with us. Before my mother could even hesitate, I quickly agreed. I have no problem with that, but there are some things we need to make clear beforehand, in front of everyone. I laid out the conditions I had already prepared. For example, I needed my own space to study and rest, so my cousin could only study and rest in the living room. Also, my cousin's living expenses would be transferred to my mother's account at $800 per month, and any other costs she incurred would be her responsibility. My mother would not cover them. My mother was only responsible for buying groceries, cooking, and cleaning. As for her clothes and luggage, my cousin had to manage them herself. As for studying, it was not my responsibility. I could lend her my notes, but she should not disturb me when I was studying. All of these conditions were set in writing, and if she broke any of them, my cousin would have to move out of our house. I put the terms in front of my aunt, and her face turned pale with rage. But in the end, she still signed the agreement with my cousin. I knew exactly why my cousin was coming back. The day she had planned to return to my grandfather's house, I had overheard my aunt and cousin making firm plans. She was willing to swallow her pride and send my cousin back because the tutoring class I was enrolled in was far too expensive. and my aunt's family was reluctant to spend that money. So, they decided that my cousin would stick to me. Whatever I learned, she would learn too. For the next class exam, she had to make it into the same advanced class as I was in. And now, my actions were directly disrupting their little scheme. Senior year always passed quickly. After the winter break, there were 3 mock exams. Unlike in my past life, where I couldn't concentrate on my studies because of my cousin clinging to me. This time, in each of the 3 exams, I performed even better than before. But my cousin was a different story. Despite her best efforts, she still failed to make it into the advanced class after the second exam. After the winter break, my mother specifically used her connections to arrange a private tutor for me, paying a large sum for the lessons. During each class, my cousin would stare enviously at my bedroom door, longing for what I had. My mother, of course, didn't want to treat my cousin too harshly. So, she discussed with the tutor and agreed that my cousin could sit by me during lessons and listen in. Well, in this life, my progress was naturally never going to match my cousin's. The tutor's pace was outrageously fast, and as for me, in order to absorb more during each lesson, I asked the tutor to focus on the difficult and important topics, skipping over the basics. After attending 3 lessons with me, my cousin realized she couldn't understand anything and couldn't keep up with my revision pace. That's when she completely broke down. I admit, I had been creating anxiety for her the whole time. She secretly called Aunt to ask if she could sign her up for a training class. But Aunt, unwilling to spend the money, just kept insisting that she follow my lead. But when you can't grasp something, you just can't grasp it. My cousin almost sank into anxiety every day, and that was when she walked right into the extreme trap I had set for her. I studied until 11 p.m. and woke up at 5 a.m. She, in turn, studied until late and woke up at 4 a.m. At first, this tactic did seem effective. Her grades slowly started to improve. But the lack of sleep, along with the long-term anxiety, began to take a toll, and it became clear in her self-imposed pressure, day after day. She started to lose memory, became slow to react, easily distracted, had palpitations, and her emotions were unstable. My mom couldn't stand it anymore and repeatedly advised her to focus on her health and get more sleep. But she yelled at my mom in a fit of anger. "Stop pretending to care. I don't need your help. Don't think I don't know. You just don't want me to outperform her in the exams. You all look down on me. You all think I'm useless. Just wait. Who wins and who loses? We'll see. When the college entrance exam results come out, I'll step on all of you." My cousin's emotions became wildly erratic. My mom couldn't take it anymore and called Aunt, hoping she would take my cousin to see a psychologist. But Aunt didn't care at all, and in fact, expressed great satisfaction with my cousin's current state. This is the right way to study. There's only one chance for the college entrance exam. As long as she doesn't collapse, let her study to the limit. Besides, going to the hospital costs money and time. She could just stay home and do more problems. Isn't that better? My mom was at a loss for words. However, since Aunt didn't care, she didn't want to bother herself with it. Instead, she turned her focus to me, increasingly worried about my mental state, fearing that my cousin might influence me. But I had already come back from my past life's failure, and I had thoroughly tackled the weaknesses I once had in subjects I wasn't good at. A month before the college entrance exams, when everyone was working doubly hard, I was unusually relaxed, without the kind of nervous tension I had in my past life. Seeing me easing up, my cousin became more and more certain that she could surpass me in the final stretch. If she maintained this pace, maybe, and not a well sigh, just maybe, she could. But she had overestimated her current physical condition. On the day of the college entrance exam, she walked into the exam room, full of confidence. But before the first exam even ended, she collapsed from exhaustion and suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. She was rushed to the hospital by the ambulance waiting outside the exam hall. When she woke up and learned that her score was 0, she became emotionally overwhelmed again and was immediately pushed back into the emergency room. On the day the results came out, I was accepted into Tingshui University with the highest score in the city. A school I had missed in my past life. My parents threw me a grand celebration. But on the day of the party, Aunt barged in with a group of reporters and, in front of the cameras, angrily accused us of not taking care of my cousin, pushing her into a breakdown and the hospital. She demanded that my mom compensate for all of my cousin's hospitalization and future expenses for repeating the year. If it weren't for you and your daughter constantly competing with each other at home, how could my daughter have ended up like this? She's only 18. She's already been in the emergency room twice and almost ended up with paralysis. I trusted you enough to let my daughter stay with you. And now she's lying in the hospital. And you and your daughter have the nerve to celebrate. My mom and I, already familiar with Aunt and her family's shamelessness, knew we couldn't let them slander us anymore. If Aunt wanted to make a scene like she did in my past life, I was more than happy to play along with her. I just didn't know whether, in the end, things would go the way she expected or she would reap what she sowed. Aunt, there's no need for you to distort the truth. You say my mom didn't take care of my cousin. But when you insisted that my mom take her in, you signed a written agreement. My mom was only responsible for my cousin's food and lodging. Everything else was her own responsibility. You didn't want to take care of her. And yet, during the crucial year of high school, you sent her to my house, not even willing to pay for a tutoring class, demanding that she follow everything I do. What's so funny about that? High school students already have enough pressure. And she couldn't keep up with what I was learning. So naturally, she had to make up for it by pushing herself to the limit. My mom and I didn't fail to advise her. But she refused to stop. We even called you. But do you want me to repeat what you said on the phone? As I methodically deconstructed her lies, Aunt's expression faltered for a moment. But in front of the camera, she could only force a confident look and continue accusing me. Your mom is her Aunt Schulten and Aunt take care of her niece? Besides, you, as her younger cousin, have such good grades. What's wrong with helping her out? The moment those utterly unreasonable words left her mouth, it wasn't just me, everyone in the banquet hall couldn't sit still anymore. Really? Like mother? Like daughter? It's no wonder you two are both crazy. You don't even have a daughter of your own. Why should you be looking after someone else's kid? You've been saying it's your daughter's own fault for getting herself into this mess. And instead of properly taking care of her in the hospital, you come here blaming others? Are you even embarrassed? Let's face it. All you want is to use your daughter to extort money, right? You gave away an empty bank card, trying to get something for nothing. How shameless. My aunt, who had been fiercely scolded by the crowd, turned betrayed in the face and couldn't say another word. In the end, ignoring the reporter still filming, she fled in a panic. Of course, this entire incident was edited by the reporters and put online, where it quickly drew scornful ridicule from netizens. My cousin and Aunt reaped what they had sown. Everything my mother and I endured in our past life was now being played out in the span of a single month, right before my aunt and cousin. In the end, my cousin, once again severely affected, was left partially paralyzed, with little hope of taking the college entrance exam. As for me, just 2 months later, I finally stepped into the dream school I had longed for in my past life. A beautiful campus life was about to begin.